Okay, well, good morning. We're gonna go ahead and get started on time. So meetings that start on time usually end on time, and that's something I really value in my work. My name is Darren Nielsen. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning for the Utah State Board of Education. It's my privilege and pleasure to be here to be able to introduce or welcome everybody and get this conference started. I was talking to Fred earlier about the seasons that we have here. And the changing of the leaves. And fall is my favorite season of the year. I like the comfortable temperatures. I'm also an outdoorsman, so hunting and fishing, the fall season is usually the best time for all those activities. And I was married in September, so we celebrate my anniversary every September. When fall is leaving, it's always a time of reflection. I don't mind winters. I also like to ski and do winter activities, but we know winter's coming because we see signs. We see the day gets a little bit shorter. There's more darkness. We leave and it's dark. We get home and it's dark in some cases. Leaves change colors, and as they start to fall from the trees, that's one of the last signs that winter's going to be around the corner, and we better make sure we have our snow tires on here in Utah. It's interesting, though, as we talk about this gathering today, those who are here with us face-to-face and those who are with us through the use of technology, sitting in the comfort of their offices. There's also signs that there's some change coming, not just in Utah, but nationally with school leadership and the role of the school principal. The value and the importance of the school leader. In the last, I became a principal in 2002.
No,
and
people just watch it.
We've got some people who need to mute the mic.
Yep,
So those of you,
that online sheet, and then
those of you who are in the field, if you'll please mute your microphones.
set up.
Trevor and Sherry, I apologize calling your names out, but if you'll please mute your mics.
Okay, that one right
This happens with our assessment director meetings as well. I'm going to go ahead and try to talk through them. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Some of the signs that we see some changes coming in the area of supporting and recognizing and acknowledging the importance of the school principal include not just the fact that we're meeting together and that there's activities that are going to be ongoing, but we see changes with the researchers. Rand, other researchers are starting to allocate and dedicate more of their time and resources to looking at the impacts of the school leader and how to improve school leadership. I was mentioning when I became principal in 2002 at the beginning of the AYP era, No Child Left Behind era, a lot of energy, and it's been this way since then, I think, could be focused on teacher professional development, but in terms of school leader professional development, it's been left up to individual LEAs, districts, to decide what they're going to do, and in some cases, I felt my first year as a principal, it was really on my shoulders to decide where am I going to get professional learning, how am I going to decide what I need, which is a challenge because I didn't know what I didn't know. And so there's signs that that's changing. And the research industry, the research body is starting to illustrate that. ESSA, the reauthorization of the ESSA plan, No Child Left Behind, also allowed states and districts to take money from title programs to support school leadership interventions. You see private institutions or nonprofits, Deloitte, which is a large accounting business. They have the Courageous Principals Institute that they bring school leaders in from around the country. They do that at a subsidized rate. And the reason they do that is they recognize how important your role is as school leaders in changing and improving school outcomes for our students. Here in Utah, the state legislature, before I started at the state board 2 years ago, there was a group of legislators that did some work throughout a year, and some of you may have been part of that, to look at what can we do in Utah to advance the school leader, the school principal. Our state board took that, and my first assignment when I started with the state board in October of 2017 was to facilitate a school leadership working group. And that group met for a year and put together 14 recommendations to make changes and improvements to supporting school leaders. 3 of those recommendations involve legislative asks, and you'll see those go before the state legislature this coming year to give them an opportunity to support school leadership in a way that hasn't been done before in the state of Utah. So those are some things. Those are some of the signs we have. So the question then is why this change all of a sudden? I think people are starting to realize the impact that the school leader has on the entire school. Your circle of influence is larger than anybody else in your building. We have great teachers in your schools, and their circle of influence, while it expands beyond the scope of their classroom with their colleagues, in terms of student impact, it really focuses within the walls of their classroom, where yours expands beyond that. As we think about influence, I don't know how many of you, I'm not a social media user. I mean, I use it for work, but in terms of personal life, how many of you are familiar with the term influencer in the social media context? It's become kind of a big thing. I think it's around 1913 is when the word influencer first is found in any type of research articles. And it referenced organizations or entities at the time that were influencing groups of people. But around 2009, 2008, the term influencer was the first time it was used to reference an individual. And as I looked at this the other day in preparation for today's comments, I found some things that were interestingly correlated to the work that you do. So online you can find a list of tips to become an influencer. So if you're social media, you want to get into that, you want to have people pay you for you putting content out, which means you're influencing people to make decisions. These are some of the tips for people who want to do that. I want you to listen to how connected these are to being an influencer in the real world, in the classrooms and the schools. Number one is to be authentic. So if you want to be an influencer, you need to be authentic in your work and the things you say and you do. Number two, focus on metrics that matter. We talk about that all the time in education, about focusing on the right metrics and the right things and getting our teachers and parents to focus on the right things. Number three, freely share your knowledge, to be open and a good communicator. Number four, be consistent in your message. And the last one that I pulled off the list is build your strategy and processes. So be really strategic in your work. So I am proud to be with you for a short time this morning. And I hope you recognize the role you play as being influencers in your building, in your communities, and in your districts, and in this case, across the state as you begin your work in this Principal Partnership Network. And welcome you to this event and hope you have a wonderful time today. Thank you.
All right. So I'm David Smith. I'm the Educational Leadership Specialist, well, one of two Educational Leadership Specialists at the State Board of Education. Lisa Young is the other. We want to just welcome you very quickly to this seminar today. We're very, very grateful that you're here. We have several people in this room here at the state capitol, but also out in numerous locations around the state who are going to be facilitating the discussions that we'll have today. If we could have those people just stand up really quickly, we'd appreciate that. So, yeah, stand up, Molly. All right. Thank you very much. So these are the people who will be doing that as we begin here. Those of you who are online, there is a link for you to sign in to make sure that we have your attendance down. That's been up on the screen. I'll put that back up in just a second before we switch over to Fred's presentation. So we're really, really grateful and honored to have Fred Brown with us today. I'm just going to read you an introduction here really quickly. This is your bio from online. Fred. Yes, well, it's fairly short. Okay, so Frederick Brown is Learning Forward's Deputy Executive Director. Prior to joining Learning Forward, he worked as a Senior Program Officer for the New York City-based Wallace Foundation and guided the work of, I don't have my glasses on, guided the work. Can you hand me my glasses, Darren? I'm sorry, folks. There we go. Now I'll be able to see what it is you've done, Fred. Okay. Where he guided the work of several major grantees, including the Southern Regional Educational Board, the Institute for Learning at the University of Pittsburgh, the states of Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, Oregon, Kansas, and New Jersey. Prior to joining the Wallace Foundation, Fred was the director of the Leadership Academy and Urban Network for Chicago, called Launch, an organization whose mission was to identify, train, and support principals for the Chicago public schools. His experience is grounded in real-world experience. He's been an elementary school teacher and principal. Yay for elementary principals. Secondary principals too, but I was an elementary principal, so I can relate. He also served as a founding member of the mathematics and equity teams for Ohio's Project Discovery, statewide initiative to improve mathematics and science instruction. Yay for math as well. Over the past 15 years, he's been a leader in designing and facilitating cutting-edge learning experiences for school and district administrators on topics such as cultural competence, leadership, and professional learning communities. So I'm proud and happy to turn the time over to Mr. Fred Brown.
Is there anyone who likes hearing their bio read? Oh gosh, no. All right, so I'm going to put this mic on for our remote listeners. So happy to be here in Salt Lake. And let me just tell a quick Salt Lake story if I can. I want to say it was 4 years ago. I was on the beach in the Bahamas, which you wouldn't expect to be the start of the story, I know. And just as I was getting to the point where I was getting ready to go onto the beach itself, I get a call from the mother of my two godchildren who lived at the time here in Salt Lake. And the sad part of the story was at that moment, my godson's mother just learned of a horrible cancer diagnosis. And it was one of those situations where we didn't know how serious it was at that moment, but it was pretty serious. He's past all of that now and has been in remission for many years, but it started because of the primary care here in Salt Lake at the Children's Hospital. And I spent a lot of time in the Children's Hospital here in Salt Lake, and let me just say, amazing care, amazing professionals, and not just the people in the hospital itself, but the community around it. We had some folks that we knew at Learning Forward who worked at an organization called School Improvement Network. And some of you may know School Improvement Network. And so the Linton family, I mentioned, I'm in Salt Lake, and they're like, what do you need? And the one thing I remember needing was a pillow, because my other godson, every time I slept in the twin bed that was at their house, and we slept in this bed, stole the pillow. So thankful to the Lintons for bringing a pillow to help me as well. So it's great to be here, and it's great to have a conversation around communities of practice. And let me just say, and I'm going to get my clicker connected to this in a second, let me just say a little bit about my own background before I jump into the actual remarks. So, yeah, that's me with a little more hair than I have now. I grew up in inner city Cleveland, Ohio, until I was age 11. And then my family moved out to very rural Northeast Ohio. And it was Amish country, which is why you see the Amish buggy. And so it was like two different childhoods, right? And as leaders, we often find ourselves in very different environments. So the inner city, where I walked out and everyone looked exactly like me, to the rural, where I was the only one who looked like me. And what was interesting about this small school that I went to, I don't know if kids still play eraser tag here in Utah, but because who has erasers anymore for chalkboards? But eraser tag was the game that they played at this small rural school. And the whole game is you put an eraser in on your head, and you have to chase someone. And if you catch them before the eraser falls off, you win, and they're it. I killed at eraser tag. I mean, never lost. I mean, I was under tables, on top, just could never lose. They actually had to change the rules of the game just because I was there. But did all of my principalship and all that work that David described was in Northeast Ohio in a small urban district about 30 miles west of Cleveland. And amazing experience working at elementary, and then also was an assistant principal at a middle school. How many middle school bless you all, because you know that middle-aged children are, but by the time I was done, loved the middle-aged child because we know all of the supports that they need. And then found myself in Chicago, which is the picture in the top right. And yes, that was a program that was a leadership academy for aspiring principals. That was a collaboration among Northwestern University, the Office of the Principals Union in Chicago, which at that time had all professional learning responsibilities for principals in Chicago public schools, which is a unique setup. If you remember the name Paul Vallis or the name Arnie Duncan, they were the two who were there when this originally was set up. And it was a principals union saying, our principals keep getting in trouble. They have to keep coming to the lawyer for advice. Things keep happening. What would it mean if we had an induction program and a aspiring program for those principals so that they went into the job better prepared? So that's how the union took responsibility for leadership development in Chicago. And then found myself in New York City at the Wallace Foundation. And if you've been following Wallace and its work around its principal pipeline initiative, its principal supervisor initiative, its university principal pipeline initiative, all of these have horrible acronyms, by the way, and its current principal pipeline expansion project, and all of the research that happened before, you know that that foundation is, like many, deeply invested in leadership. And so I'll reference some of the pieces of Wallace research just for you to keep in mind. But the one thing I would suggest is if you're interested in looking at all things leadership, wallacefoundation.org, and visit their Knowledge Center, which is on the website, full of resources and supports for leadership. So some of the quotes that you hear now in the field, among all school-related factors, leadership is second only to teaching in terms of what a difference it makes in the lives of children and their progress. Principles as the multiplier of effective teaching from a report from Paul Manna. The fact that there's no documented case of a school, a troubled school, being turned around without the influence and support of an effective principal. And there are others that you'll hear when you look at and read the Wallace research that are really important. So, and then 10 years ago, found myself at Learning Forward. And Learning Forward is the only organization in the country that is focused solely on educator professional learning. It was an offshoot of ASCD. There was like a small group of folks, this is over 50 years ago, who joined ASCD or who left AFCD and said, we need an organization just for us because we do professional learning. And that was the beginning of the National Staff Development Council, or NSDC, some of you may have heard of NSDC. And our name changed to Learning Forward in 2010. You see the vision and the mission of the organization, and this whole notion of equity and excellence becomes a big part of how we think about this work.
How to turn the audio
So
on.
today this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? We're going to talk a little bit about communities of practice, problems of practice. I'm not here to give you all the answers when it comes to what does that mean. What I'm hoping you all will do is collectively co-construct what it means to have an effective community of practice in your work and in your region. So this is not about me saying this is how you should do it. This is inviting you into a conversation about what might these kinds of ideas look like in your setting. And so if we agree that in schools it's everyone's job to learn, and I think you as leaders of learning, because one of the things I always have believed is that the principal is the leader of learning for adults and for children in their schools. And so you are the talent development experts. So as with all folks in the school, it's your job to learn just as much as it is for the kids and for the teachers. And so it makes me wonder, how is learning structured for you in your systems, in your districts, in your regions, if you're part of a regional network, or even just in your own school? The question is, how is leadership or learning for leaders structured? What of these models that are on the screen, which one looks most closely like how learning for leaders is structured? And what I'm going to ask you to do right now, I invite you to not talk to anyone, But in a second, I'm going to count to 3. And at the top of 3, I'm going to ask you to put your hand in the air. And you can wave it like you just don't care if you want. But at least put your hand in the air with a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. That's your response to the question, how learning for leaders is structured in your school. So is everyone ready to put their hand in the air with a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 on their hand? Okay, not yet. Got a couple early adopters here, which is great. Not quite yet. So we all ready. So on the count of 3, I want to see hands in the air. And at that moment, you are committed to your choice. And I would ask you to keep your hand up in the air. How learning for leaders is structured. What model comes closest? 1, 2, and some of you aren't even getting ready to put your hand up. I can see you. Some people are literally sitting on their hands. Okay. So hands ready to move. 1, 2, 3. So as you look around the room, you're going to see some differences, right? You're going to see some folks with 3s and 5s, etc. Here's the conversation I invite you to have right now. Why did you make the choice that you made? What are the examples of how that looks in your school or in your setting? And this is a conversation with a shoulder partner, someone who's near you, groups of 2 or 3. Why did you make the choice that you made? Take about 2 or 3 minutes to have that conversation, please.
So I did. Had a free. Right. You have one choice.
Take another 30 seconds for your conversation. All right, so let's come back together.
So let's be honest.
And 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So did anyone choose 1? And what was some of the logic behind, for anyone who chose a 1, what would you say was your reasoning for that choice? Yes.
I'm in a church,
Okay.
and so that the difficulty is that if I don't have available, where people will come to me, and what
Got it.
is to call the state office, like I know what. What about this? What did I say? I'm always out.
So it's kind of like you're feeling a bit disconnected, and if you don't actively go after the information, you're saying it doesn't necessarily come to you easily.
Other than I know enough that I
Gotcha.
get that.
Gotcha. No, that's helpful. Okay. Other interpretations of 1? Yes.
I work with a lot of small
Just kind of trickles down the information. Got it. So one is pretty common. And what I'm hearing from one is this feeling of I don't have ownership. It's one of those things where the information comes to me and sometimes I have to go after it, is what I'm hearing for one. Does someone choose two? And what was your interpretation of two, if you'd be willing to share? Yeah.
We basically we're middle school and we have
Mm.
we're constantly working with our group, but we're also
So with this one, let's see if this is turn this on. So with this one, it's like the interconnectedness is part of what I'm hearing as an appeal for this one. And you can imagine different groups having connections with all the various other groups in this model. You can see a little bit of that in three. Who chose three? Okay. Could someone make a comparison between 2 and 3, or just share something that came out of your conversation around 3? Yes, please.
I'm going to call it
Mm-hmm.
one from each grade, and you got your plus. I wanted to combine it with
Yes.
that leadership moves out. So it's not like they're assuming.
Yep. That's a great point. Often when people see these, and I know we're just looking at dots and circles and lines, but in your mind, you start thinking about how you can combine and have the best elements of one and embed that within the other. So lots of overlap and opportunities for that in 2 and 3. 4 is a kind of a different animal. Anyone choose 4? Oftentimes I get people, I don't know what the heck 4 is. Like, what is that supposed to be? So 4, I'll give you an example of when people have chosen 4. You know, they imagine this dot at the top as someone who has access to information, whatever that information or knowledge might be. And that person may interact with a small group of folks who then has responsibility for spreading that information out in the system, right? So you can imagine at the very bottom of this person, it seems to only have an interaction with this person, but this person is part of various networks. And then that person starts to spread some of the information. So just another way to think about ideas. And then when you get to number 5, anybody choose 5? Okay, how did you describe 5? Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So 5 starts to feel a little chaotic and haphazard. Yep. So part of, as we go through today, what I'm trying to do is introduce just a few nuggets of ideas that might be elements of your problem of practice. As you think about school improvement, as you think about what do I want to tackle and change, what's the small nugget that if we could fix this, we could move our school forward? Those become elements that could be considered part of your own personal or professional problem of practice. And so just store these somewhere. And so one of the elements is, how do we structure learning for adults? And one of the things that I'll talk about in a second are the standards for professional learning, which provide a roadmap for how that could be done, is one way to do it, but that's just a question. And the other question or the other thing to keep in mind is how long it or what it takes to change someone's practice. So we're going to watch a video real quick. So I'll give the remote folks the heads up that we're about to go to the video that they have the link to. And this video, I'm hoping, kind of sets the stage for a little of the conversation that we'll have later today.
Hey, Destin, welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? But I did something. I did something that damaged my mind. It happened on the streets of Amsterdam, and I got really scared, honestly. I can't ride a bike like you can anymore. Before I show you the video of what happened, I need to tell you the backstory. Like many 6-year-olds with a MacGyver moment, I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I learned a life skill, and I was really proud of it. Everything changed, though, when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses, and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle, and he wanted me to try to ride it. He'd only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike, ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Justin Taylor. First attempt riding the bicycle.
Yeah, I barely knew it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually...
One of the really early prototypes we were playing around with, like the folding mechanism, which you could see is a bunch of hinges.
...was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding.
Mr. Justin Sandlin.
This is probably just an uncoordinated engineer.
I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Justin's probably just an uncoordinated engineer and can't do it. But that's not the case at all. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it. Downwards force on the pedals, leaning your whole body, pulling and pushing the handlebars, gyroscopic precession in the wheels, every single force is part of this algorithm. And if you change any one part, it affects the entire control system. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I'm telling you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. You might think you can, but you can't. I know this because I'm often asked to speak at universities and conferences, and I take the bike with me. It's always the same. People think they're going to try some trick or they're just going to power through it. It doesn't work. Your brain cannot handle this. For instance, this guy, I offered him $200 just to ride this bike 10 feet across the stage. Everybody thought he could do it.
No, you didn't understand. You didn't understand. So, this way. All right, so, whatever you're ready. Yeah. Go ahead. No, you have to keep your feet on. Dude, all right, here we go. Wait. Like, you gotta start rolling at least. And go. Oh, go! All right, back up. Okay, keep your feet on the pedal. Go.
Sometimes
Go right off. Just keep your feet on the pedal. Yes, all right, one more time.
Once you have a rigid way of thinking in your head, sometimes you cannot change that, even if you want to. So here's what I did. It was a personal challenge. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike, and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road I was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm and I would wreck. But at least I could ride it. My son is the closest person to me genetically, and he's been riding a normal bike for 3 years. That's over half his life. I wanted to know how long it would take him to learn how to ride a backwards bike, so I told him if he learned how to ride a backwards bike, he could go with me to Australia and meet a real astronaut.
Are you going to give up? Go ahead. This is how it starts. Look at this. This is such a big deal. Get up, you got it. Did you see his brain get it? So in how many weeks have we been doing this? 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, he did something that took me 8 months to do. which demonstrates that a child has more neuroplasticity, am I even saying that right, than an adult.
It's clear from this experiment that children have a much more plastic brain than adults. That's why the best time to learn a language is when you're a young child. All right, today's bike log. I can ride smooth, I can ride fast. I'm thinking the experiment is over.
Okay, now I'm in Amsterdam, a city that has more bicycles than people. The question is, can I ride a normal bike now? I mean, I've spent all this time unlearning how to ride a bike. If I go back and try to ride a normal one, will my brain mess up? So I've tweeted a Smarter Everyday meetup, if you will, and I'm going to see if somebody brings a bicycle, and I'm going to try to ride a normal bike.
This was one of the most frustrating moments of my life. I had ridden a normal bike since I was 6, but in this moment, I couldn't do it anymore. I had set out to prove that I could free my brain from a cognitive bias, but at this point, I'm pretty sure that all I proved is that I could only redesignate that bias.
So what you're not seeing is just a group of people here looking at me, looking at the strange American that can't ride a bike because they think I'm dumb. But I'm actually 2 levels deep into this because I've learned and unlearned. All right.
After 20 minutes of making a fool out of myself, suddenly my brain clicked back into the old algorithm. I can't explain it, but it happened in a very specific moment.
Got it. I'm back. Oh, it clicked. Hold on, it clicked. I got it. Okay, there it is. There was the moment. Okay, I can ride a bike.
I tried to explain this to the people around me, and they just didn't get it. They thought I was faking the previous 20 minutes, and I couldn't get anybody to believe me.
That looked like I faked that, didn't it? Yeah. Just a fake. You think I'm faking. You don't believe me. You think I'm lying, don't you? I'm not lying.
I felt like the only person on the planet who had ever unlearned how to ride a bike, and I couldn't articulate it to anyone because everybody just knew that you can't forget how to ride a bike. So I learned 3 things from this
first
experiment.
question is, how many of you think you could ride the bike? There's always somebody who thinks they can. No one?
You have the bike here.
Can we bring the bike in from the back, please? I'm totally kidding, but so that's one of those that would be fun to watch, right? So a couple things. Whenever I show a video, I like to tell people how you can get it. So if you just put in, I used to say Google something, but I was at a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded meeting once, and it was suggested I say use the search engine of your choice. So as you can imagine, I'm now saying use your search engine of choice to backwards bicycle smarter every day. You can get that video. So a couple of things about the video. It's always interesting where that video plays. So there are certain parts of the country where the MacGyver mullet, like people are like, oh, I get that, and there's a laugh. And certainly there are other parts like MacGyver mullet, like what is a mullet? So, and then the other scene that's always fun is when the poor child falls off the bike and he's like, get up. And there's parts of the country where it's like, this poor child, how can you let this child be on the ground this way? And others are like, yeah, get up. So, but the important part of the video is, what does this have to do with learning? What does this have to do with how we learn and how we think about structuring, in particular, adult learning? And so I would ask you or invite you to have a conversation now with your colleagues again on what are the connections or implications of what we just saw in adult learning for teachers, for leaders, et cetera, in your environments. So I'll let you have that conversation now.
It's me, Destin.
Oh, sorry.
The elements, all of how it should look,
all the right. And when you really go deeply into it, they're replicating their own experiences when they were in school. Traditions, habits, mental. They are learning. Interesting.
Okay, take another 30 seconds for your conversation. All right, so let's come back together in 3, 2, and 1. So thank you for having that conversation. Let me make sure I'm off mute. Yep. So I want to hear a little bit about what your conversation was. What were some of the connections you made between this video and talent development, adult learning, any of those things in your school? And I'm going to ask for some responses from the room that I'm standing in, and I'm also going to ask for a response or two from our online folks. So we'll start with someone from the room. What came out of your conversation? Yes, please. Mm-hmm. So, and that's really interesting because this whole need to know why are we doing this change, and being very upfront about why we are making the change becomes a case. It was his stubbornness and like, I'm going to show those welders that I can do this. I think is how it started, right? But over time, it became like this vendetta, like I need to figure out what's going on up here so I can figure out this change. And so he was very upfront about sort of why he was going into this. So great point. Other reactions? Oh, absolutely. Other comments? Yes. Mm-hmm. Was being the principal. So the comment being, thinking about now I'm a principal and thinking back to before I was a teacher, and the idea of being a principal is like riding this bicycle because it's easy to go back to what it was like when you were a teacher. And what's interesting that your comment raises is this whole notion of how long does it take someone to figure out this, whatever the new thing is? So in this case, it took them how long? Like 8 months to like finally figure out how to ride this bicycle. The commitment and the internal desire to do this became a big part of his change process as he was going through this. I want to take a comment from someone online who's joined us. None yet. Okay, we'll hold off on that. As you think about, yeah, one more here. Mm-hmm.
And so I knew people had never. So it was a task. What surprised me most was the unwillingness to change. The results were in our face.
Yep.
Here's where we are.
Right.
The unwillingness from the pushback was really surprising. I mean, what a different environment.
Absolutely.
Kind of be able to say, no, we're going to do this different. We're going to do this. And no, that didn't happen at all.
So this whole point of going into a new school environment as a principal and facing resistance to change and how that can be a real surprise to those of us who are not used to that based on the previous experiences that we've had is a comment that was just made. And the resistance to change is something that all of us deal with in some way, shape, or form. How many of you are familiar with this concerns-based adoption model, or CBAM? Definitely worth the check. So Shirley Hord is one of its authors, H-O-R-D. And one of the things that model sort of explores are what we call stages of concern and stages of use. And this whole notion that we all go through this process of, one could call it a mourning process, as we mourn the loss of what was, as we anticipate what's to come. And we go through this process where we see whatever the innovation is, and at first we're like, yeah, whatever that is over there, it doesn't pertain to me, but I recognize that it's happening, all the way up to, I got to figure out how to invest myself in whatever this change is and make it work, all the way up to, I'm going to innovate with this idea and take it to the next level. And so we go through these stages as we're thinking about our change, our own internal change process. But your point is spot on. The other thing about this video is it takes, as we said, 8 months for him. But in schools and school districts, and I know this doesn't happen in Utah, but in other states, there will be an initiative that's released at the beginning of the school year, and they'll bring everyone together and say, here's the new literacy program, and then that's the last support that anybody receives. And the assumption is everyone heard about it, they got the materials, so they're all set to go. And we know the reality is it just doesn't work that way, because change and learning is complicated. And so if you've not seen the CASAB model is one way to think about just the complexity of the change and learning process. Because in the video, the knowledge, he knew how to ride the bike. He knew that you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. That was the knowledge. That's all you needed. And all the other parts about how to ride a bike, he knew those things as well. So he had the knowledge, but he didn't have the skill, which in this case is the process to apply the knowledge that you have. So how do you create a learning experience that pays attention not just to knowledge, but also to skill? And then when you look at the 2 A's in the CASAB model, the attitude and the aspiration, how do you create a learning experience that takes into account the attitude of those who are experiencing the learning, their desires and their aspirations, so that you know that you have buy-in? What kinds of things can you do culturally in your school so that the 2 A's are at higher levels, right? Because whatever the new thing is, whatever the it is, you want people to be excited about it, not dreading it. And then at the end of the day, it's all about the behavior. What practice changed as a result of whatever the learning was? And so there's so many learning experiences that I've been a part of where no one really cared about the B. All they paid attention to is, well, we gave them the K, so we did our job. I hope that the B works out, but I'm not too worried about that. As principals, you're very invested in the B, right? Because with all the learning that happens in your school for teachers and for students, you want their practice to change, or for students, you want the results on whatever formative or summative assessments you have to show progress. And so we're always thinking about the KASAB, and we're thinking about that in ways that really matter. The other thing we're always paying attention to is, so what are the kinds of things that we can do in schools? And this is the very small piece of John Hattie's work. And those of you who are visible learning and John Hattie fans know that when he talks about effect size, he says anything with a 0.4 or higher effect size are the things that we should pay attention to more. His argument wasn't stop doing the things that are less than 0.40, but if it's a matter of where do we spend our time, 0.4 and higher are places that he suggested you do. And so when you look at these things on the left, suggesting that these things matter less. And when you get all the way down to ability grouping, 0.12. Interestingly, when you get down to retention, negative 0.13. Now, for those of you who know this work, it was a meta-analysis of lots of various studies. So there are those who are like completely invested and bought into the way he represents these data, and there are others who say, oh, that's just hogwash. But overall, it creates a conversation around the kinds of things that we should pay attention to when it comes to the work we do in schools. So when you look on the right and you see like student expectations of 1.44, we know that if we have high expectations for kids, they do better, right? Just because we treat them like they'll do better and they rise to our expectations. And some of the other things there. But at the top, at 1.57, which is kind of off the charts when it comes to what matters more, is this whole notion of teacher, and I would argue also leader, collective efficacy, which he defines as teachers and leaders co-constructing, working together, talking about their practice, and doing that in collaboration with their peers and assuming collective responsibility for a group of either teachers, students, whatever the case may be. So this whole notion of working together collaboratively is something that we know makes a huge difference when it comes to changing practice. And we heard from the Smarter Every Day, 8 months, but on average, about 2 months before something becomes, and this is what practice becomes sort of a habit or something that we can say now this is what we do normally. And so we know it takes time, and I'm sure in your schools and in your districts, you have systems for professional learning to support what happens for teachers and for leaders. Several colleagues of mine, we wrote a book, Becoming a Learning System. And in that book, we were trying to think through what does it mean for a school or a district to be a learning system, a place where learning for adults is valued as much as it is for students. And you see some of the other bullets here where their practices are aligned to what we know and expect for our student learning outcomes. But that third bullet, that collaborative commitment, that's part of the work that you all are embarking on in these principal networks, right? This whole notion of I'm not just paying attention to my own students, they're very important, but I'm collaborating with others and assuming, in a sense, collective responsibility for other students, perhaps that are not even in my school. And this whole notion of precise feedback, conditions that scale and sustain effective practices, all of these are part of what we call, and these are just pieces of it, remember, tips of the iceberg here. And then this whole last celebrate and honor success, which we'll talk about in just a bit. So if our goal is to have a learning system, one of the tools that we always talk about, we know Learning Forward, are the standards for professional learning. Has anyone in the room, besides me and at least one other person I know, heard of the standards for professional learning? Okay, so 5, 6 of us, excellent. The reason I point you to the standards is because oftentimes there are people who say, and they say it well-intentioned, wouldn't it be great if we had a set of standards or something that painted a picture of what effective professional learning could look like in schools, what the conditions would be needed to support it, what the role of the leader would be in it? Wouldn't it be great? And the reality is that's what the standards are. They create that roadmap of what effective professional learning can look like. And so I invite you, if you're interested in going deeper in the standards, www.learningforward.org, and on the website of Learning Forward is information about the standards. There are videos that describe the standards in great detail and show examples of them in use. But I'll just give you one example of how they could play out in your school because it might help you as you think about, so what's my problem of practice related to adult learning? So you're the school leader, which is the leadership standard. And it's your responsibility to have a real strong sense of what effective professional learning can look like and should look like for teachers and others in your building. It's your role to have a sense of what kind of resources, and that's the resources standard, teachers need in order to effectively engage in professional learning. So do they have time to come together as a community of practice of teachers? Is the building schedule set up so that the grade level teams at the elementary level and perhaps the subject area teams at the high school level or across curricular groups, can they all get together and talk about their lesson plans, their units, and their practice? Have you paved the way for that to happen? Or is every teacher kind of working in isolation, trying to figure it all out? Do you provide, again, with the resources standard, coaching support? Does your system provide coaching support? So when it comes to the new literacy program or whatever it might be, do they have access to coaches? Do they have people who will give them precise feedback other than you on their practice? So that's some of what's in the resources standard. When it comes to the implementation standard, and this is the last one I'll reference as an example, when you do all the things that you do to help your teachers and other educators learn, do you pay attention to the implementation of those new practices? And are there structures set up that you as the leader working with your team have set up to help that implementation? Because if at the end of the day, it's just we taught it and we hope that they do it, we know that's not going to work. And so what are some of the strategies that you all can consider as leaders to provide those kind of conditions to support effective implementation? So those are the standards. And one of the standards that I didn't mention was the learning community standard. And what I'm starting to do right now is work my way into, if you can imagine some concentric circles that I'll show you in a minute, into the community of practice. So at the very outside, this whole notion that we have learning communities that pay attention to continuous improvement. We're all engaged in a cycle of continuous improvement. All of our students, all of our teachers, all of us. And so that's part of the learning community standard, that we're always looking for ways to improve. We always assume collective responsibility. So it's just not my kids. I'm caring about all of the kids in the school, and we're aligned to the goals that the school and the district have set. Now, no one here has ever done this, but when I was a principal in Ohio, the last day before the beginning of the summer vacation, we would post the class list. Who would get what teacher the following year? It's always a huge moment in the elementary school. I'm sure in some ways it plays itself out in middle schools as well, and to a lesser degree in high is my guess. At the end of the school year, May or June, is when I would get the people who would come in, the parents who would say, Mr. Brown, I need my child in Miss Jones' class next year. What can we do to make that happen? And I would always respond, if you write an educationally, appropriate letter that describes why Mrs. Jones is the appropriate fit for your child, it's something we can consider. But we use all kinds of different reasons and structures and processes for class placement. So then they'd hear all that, write the letters. The last day before summer vacation, class list, I have them in my hands. I would literally walk to the front door of the school and post them on the door as I then walked to my car, got in my car, and drove away, because everybody was gathered there waiting to look to see where their child was going, what class they had. What I wanted to be able to say, and didn't have it in my brains to say it at that point, was, it doesn't matter what class your child is in my school, because here, all of our teachers at the third grade level assume collective responsibility for all the children in third grade. Your child doesn't have access to just Mrs. Jones. She has access to Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson's expertise as well, because they collaborate, they share their best ideas, they share best practices. And so the learning community standard is structured in such a way that that's what we're trying to do with those who are involved in the learning community. But it just doesn't happen throwing people together in a room. It happens when you put structures and processes in place to help support it. I'm going to pause here, because I want you to, in your small groups, just have this conversation. In what ways are your schools structured to support the kind of collaboration that I just described? How are learning teams gathered? What kinds of resources do they have? How do you think about adult learning in your school? And you can go back to remember that first with the dots and the circles? Some of that may play into your conversation in terms of how it's structured for those in your settings. But how is learning for teachers and educators structured in your schools? That's the conversation I'd like you to have for about 2 or 3 minutes. Just another 30 seconds. So we're going to come back together in 3, 2, and 1. All right, thank you for that conversation. We now have the benefit of a microphone. And it's primarily not for the people in this room because you can hear each other, but just to help our online folks hear the comments that come out of this room. So, David, I'm first going to ask our online folks to give you a message if they have a comment, and we do have one. Yes.
So this is from Stephen Brand.
Yep.
He says we have Monday afternoon time for collaboration. Each Monday is designed for a specific interaction. First Monday of each month is for our tier 1.5 grade level teams. Talk about students and develop a common intervention for students across the grade groups. Second Monday of each month is for departmental PLC meetings, using data to develop common assessments, etc. The third Monday of each month is for faculty meetings. The fourth Monday is for individual prep time and Canvas course development.
Awesome. So what was just laid out there was this whole notion that we're not going to leave the learning to chance, right? And that system, we had some very clear structures in place with some specific things that we were working on in each one of those periods of time. And I love the fact that there was this collaboration with grade level teams. There was a real focus on data. So there's a structure in place. And I would argue if I were going back to the standards for professional learning, I would be able to connect it to the outcomes, data, leadership, resource, learning communities, learning design, implementation, all of those standards I heard play out in some of that example. So appreciate the online response. Someone in the room, something that came up from your conversation.
If you just raise your hand.
There we go. By the way, I have amazing wait time, so I know you've got things to say. And the other thing I'll do is if I don't hear a response, I'll just hover over someone and just like kind of steer them into a response. So here we go. See, he felt the pressure over here. So as the mic is coming around, one of the things to keep in mind is, and the example that we just heard here, and what I'm guessing we're going to hear in a minute, is being intentional about these structures and being intentional about these systems. What would you add?
What I heard here, discussion was you've had structure set up for many years. They're still never perfect. You always have to continue to try to figure out how to make them more effective. Follow up on our end with the implementation piece so that the outcomes are becoming what we like to see.
So on that point, I think it's a great point. I'm trying to figure out where I put yeah. So as an example of that, and you want to say a few more things, but as an example of that, this whole notion of, there was a video that I could show you that shows a learning team in action. And so I would suggest that you use your preferred search engine and put in Ford Middle School, Learning Forward. Ford like the car, middle school, and then Learning Forward. And in this learning team, what you see are teachers talking about their student work, and they're talking about their practice, and they're setting up visits to each other's classrooms to try out these new strategies. They are going through this whole cycle of continuous improvement themselves. And whenever I show that video, people look at it and say, did they just start spontaneously happening, like talking like that when they got in the room? And of course, the answer is no. What guided their conversation early on were protocols. You're going to go through a protocol later today that we always ask when you do a protocol for the first time, do it just as it was written so that you can see how to actually use it as it was intended and then make your modifications later. Another resource that I would suggest you consider exploring is one that Learning Forward, the affiliate in Ontario, Canada, created, and it's called The Power of Protocols. And this document that has, I can't remember, like 20 or 30 pages, there's all these different protocols that someone might use to get learning teams or groups of people who are collaborating around their practice going and getting them started in some strategies to guide their conversations. So we have to be really intentional about what those conversations look like. And Molly, you're going to add something else too. And I think we covered it. So the whole idea here is you all are, I know we're not starting from scratch here, have systems in place to guide adult learning in your schools. And if I'm at this outer circle earlier, I was just talking about the learning community and what does that look like in that learning community. You can imagine their own cycle of improvement or analysis. And if you look at the example that's on the screen, and this is out of a book called Becoming a Learning Team, which tries to go deep into what does the work of the learning team look like? What are they doing? What activities are they engaged, or in what activities are they engaged? And so any learning team, any cycle of continuous improvement, any, as we'll look later, PDSA cycle goes through this kind of process. We're always looking at data. We're setting goals, not just for our students or our teachers, whatever the case may be, but also for ourselves. And we're thinking about how do we learn, not just individually, but collaboratively in order to increase our capacity to respond to whatever the data are telling us. And then we implement and do whatever that new thing is that we're learning. This is the very surface level, 20,000-foot view of this cycle. And then we monitor and adjust practice. Looks like any cycle that you've seen and that you've worked with in your own setting. So if our community of practice, and you'll notice what we're doing is we're thinking at this in two ways. We're thinking as you as the principal leading learning in your system, but then I also invite you to step back and think about you as a principal contributing to your own learning. And what does or could your community of practice look like, and what kind of structures could guide its conversation so that you all develop collective responsibility and improve in your practice. So this is kind of the learning communities in general framework. If we start to go in a little bit more into, so then what does a specific community of practice look like? And, you know, the whole notion of community and practice, this book has become like my Bible when it comes to communities of practice. And I wanted to look at what the year was. And you know, you use a book a lot when you can just see us all bent up and full of highlights. So this year was not written down in the book. Here we go. 1998 was when I first dove into this book around communities of practice. And while there have been new editions and new versions of this, the whole notion of a community of practice as this entity within an organization that's trying to realize the dreams of a learning organization that involves groups of people come together who have a passion or share a concern for something, and they're really working hard to try to figure out solutions to those problems that they're trying to solve. Communities of practice have lots of different rules and guidelines and structures and processes that are part of it. And the cool thing about what you all will co-create is you can think about, so what elements of a community of practice do we think are important? Depending on where you are in the state, what kinds of ways of engagement are workable and doable in your community of practice? Because for some of you, it might be very easy to come together and sit across a table and really hammer through a problem. And for others, you might be gathered remotely across the state and you each have a passion for something that connects you and brings you together, but you're not physically in the same room. So how do we work through all of those kinds of things will become your challenge going forward. So Learning Forward had a community of practice that we created that was called our PD Redesign Community. And part of what we tried to think through for our community of practice are the 6 elements that you see here. And so one of them was this real clear focus on a problem of practice. And after we take our intermission and we come back, there's going to be conversation about, so what is a problem of practice? What could be our problem of practice? And how do we work through a problem of practice structure? And then this whole notion of using inquiry and active learning. This whole idea that we're not going to stand here and tell you, here are all the things you ought to be doing, so just do it. We know that doesn't work for us as adults, and we certainly know it doesn't work for children. And this whole notion of collective ownership. That in our community of practice, we had in one of these practice or groups, 14 very large school districts, Long Beach, California, New York City, Washington, D.C., and they were all part of this community of practice. And one of the things that we realized was the needs in Washington, D.C. and New York are very different than they were in Long Beach, California, and some of our smaller districts. But the same collective ownership happened across the network because we realized that with all of our differences and all the things that we have to deal with that are unique to our own setting, there's so many things that bring us together in terms of issues and concerns. And so they began to think about what could be a collective problem of practice that we can consider. And one of the collective problems of practice for one of the teams was this whole notion of how to develop learning systems for adults. Didn't matter our school setting. That was a common problem of practice. And within that, another common problem of practice is how do we document the impact of that learning for adults? What systems or structures can we put in place to make sure that the learning actually made a difference? So that collective ownership becomes really important. And then this notion of an appropriate mix of participants. In any community that we've run, there are some people who absolutely have to be in and a part of it. Otherwise, it doesn't get the traction in the rest of the system, right? So as you think about who are the folks who should be involved because they are a informal or formal leader in your systems or in your schools, because if they're involved and they get excited about whatever the it is, and everyone's like, well, gosh, if Molly's into it, then I guess I need to figure out what this thing is and participate myself. So that's one appropriate mix. The other appropriate mix is how many of you in your schools have assistant principals? Okay, so then the question becomes to what degree, because my guess is all of you see yourselves as developing talent among your assistant principals, right? Our goal for those who are assistant principals who want to be principals is to give them the kinds of learning and leadership experiences so that one day they can lead a school. And so how do we get them involved in whatever the it might be? So those are all things that you're thinking about. Number 5, this whole idea of just don't let them out there and run. What kind of structures do we have to support implementation of whatever the new ideas became our number 5. And our number 6 is one that I don't know if it plays out here, but I'll explain it anyway. In our community of practice, we wanted a governance structure that involved participants from each of the districts who would come together as a governing body and help us as a larger community think about how to structure the learning for the community. And so by having this governance body that had representation from each of the districts, we made sure that whatever the learning was that we were asking people to engage in had the blessing and support of each of the participating districts. So as you think about your network here in Utah and think about how decisions get made about what gets discussed, et cetera, the idea of a governance or decision-making body might be something that may be of interest to you all. So then when it comes time to actually go through the cycle, and we'll do this a bit more, one of the models out of the community of practice structure, you'll notice the similarities. We're looking at data, we're assessing current state, we're going through a cycle, and at the end of the day, we're going to adjust and see if it's making a difference, and then we're going to go back and try something new. So we started at learning communities in a very general sense. We talked a little bit about communities of practice as an example of a learning community. We didn't go deep into the attributes of a community of practice, but that's something I invite you to do in your own exploration. And we talked a little bit here about a community of practice approach as they deal with their problems of practice. I'm going to go one more circle deeper and look at the whole notion of a networked improvement community. And those of you who follow the work out of Carnegie know that network improvement communities, or NICs, have a very specific structure that they follow. And the book Learning to Improve, Tony Breik, and I remember I had a chance to interact with Tony Breik when we were in Chicago together because he was at the University of Chicago before moving out to Carnegie out in California. And so they have a very improvement science approach to the community of practice that's very specific and it has very straightforward structures. So one of the things is the community is focused on a very specific aim or purpose. It's all about accomplishment. It's all about we are coming together to take a small grain size of an issue that we as a community think we can solve. And we make sure that we develop a very deep understanding of whatever that issue is. Which means we're gathering more data, we're reading, we're developing theories, and we're just thinking through what is it going to take to move us from current state to desired state. And as I said, this whole process is very disciplined. It's not to chance what steps one takes as they're going through a networked improvement community structure and using the elements of, as that 4th bullet says, improvement science. But the whole idea is we're not just developing a strategy or an idea or a solution to solve our immediate problem. As that last bullet says, we're also trying to think through then how can we share these best practices, scale them in such a way that they impact others in our systems or in our schools. And so a very, very structured approach in the improvement science. So basically, and I apologize for those letters because you can't see them as clearly in the light, But on the outside, we're looking at learning communities, kind of going a little bit more inside into a community of practice and the network improvement community. But in that inner circle is what you all will create for yourselves here, right? And this whole notion of Utah's principal network and communities of practice is something that you'll co-create. And so before we're going to take a break in just a second, have you all talk about what does that look like and some other things. But I'm going to pause for a second and just ask you to reflect on what are you thinking about right now when it comes to communities of practice, your work in the state, your vision for some of the partnership work that you hope will happen in the state. Just what are you thinking right now? It's a conversation I'd like you to have at your tables for about 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, bringing you back together in 3, 2, and 1. So here's where the rest of this morning goes, just so you know the structure of today. Am I standing right in front of? No. Okay. So at this point, we're just kind of whetting your appetite, getting you to start thinking about all kinds of things. And I'm hoping the conversation you just had was a start to that. But the way today is structured is I talk for about an hour, and then we've got some guided conversations that are happening for about a half hour, and then I'll come back for another hour, and then more guided conversations for the next half hour. But I wanted to build in a break for you all, particularly those of you who are here in the room with me before we got into those guided conversations. So right now, it's like, I don't know, 9:53 according to my Mac. At 10 o'clock or soon after, for those people who are in the room, I would love for you to come back. No, you know where they are. They're just around that corner. But come back, and then your facilitators and your tables will guide you through conversation that will be either aligned to these questions, which I put out as prompts, or whatever else is coming to mind as a result of the conversation that we've had so far. So that's what we'll do between 10 and 10:30. And then at 10:30, I'll pick back up with problems of practice and actually ask you to engage in your own tuning protocol around a problem of practice that you'll want to bring to the group. So that's the rest of the morning. We'll take a break right now, and we'll come back around 10 o'clock for these conversations internally. David, anything I should have said that you would say if you were standing here?
Nope. And everything I would say. And
Oh, got it. So I think you're all set for the break. All right, we'll see you in a few. Got it. Okay. So is the PC user in the room, or are you a fellow Mac? Okay, got it. I got it. Good point. Yeah, there you go. There you go. I love the back of your shirt. I love the back of the shirt. That's great. Teaching tomorrow's leaders is what it says. Yeah, exactly. All right, so this is our meeting from Sid.
Fred, you're awesome. Okay,
So-
she's tracking us down.
So I don't know what that means. So
Well, I can get in a car. I'm 10 minutes from anywhere.
what I'll say is that she tracks me down and has like real time. And I'll be like, okay, let me reach out to Janice and see if I can get her here. She tracks us down and she doesn't have real time. I'll get you on the phone. And then you'll be on speaker and I'll just be in the room, but we'll still have the same conversation. And I will call Elizabeth and tell her all of this is in flux and we'll see.
So the image is when 5 people raise their hands.
Mhm.
That's the need.
There you go. I like that.
That's the need. 5 people raise their hands.
So say that, wait.
So when you asked, you said, who in the room knows about the standards
That, yeah.
for professional learning?
There's your evidence.
And this group of thoughtful people, 5 people raised their hand.
Right.
And when I asked that question with 24 graduate students, half doc, half master's level, I had 2 people.
There's, yeah.
And so there's the need.
Yep. No, I think that's a great example. Great example.
Nice job.
Oh, thank you.
So smooth.
Well,
Practice.
There you go. There you go. Hey, Elizabeth, how are you? I can. I just thought I'd reach out to you real quick and just let you know that Sid reached out to us or reached out to me. She responded to my text yesterday and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I was in all these areas where I couldn't talk and I really wanted to be on the call, but I just couldn't get a call to go through." And then she also said, yeah, and then she said, I really, like, can we talk tomorrow before your session, after your session? Let me know. And I said, I told her that my morning is full, and then in the afternoon, it's a bit more flexible. And so her last text was, well, I'll track you down. At some point, I'll track you down. So I'm saying all that to say, and I told this to Janice, who has said she'll be on speed dial if I get Sid in the room. And if Sid has lots of time, she'll come over. We'll try to have a conversation that we're going to have yesterday. And if you're available, I'll also circle you in to the call as well if it happens. All right, so I'm going to bring you all back together. Turn my mic back on. So the folks who are remote, it's you ever have one of those moments where you had the mic on and you just kept talking and talking, didn't realize that you're just sharing everything with the world? So I just had one of those fun moments, and I'm glad, as I was on my phone call, it was a great call, it was a good conversation, but I'm glad someone told me about that before I went to the restroom with the mic on, because I've had that nightmare for other presenters where you hear that sound in the background, you're like, oh, no one told them that the mic was still on. So now that we're all here, the conversations that you're having are structured conversations around either the questions that I put before you or other conversation related to other issues that's top of mind. And we have our facilitators who are in place to guide us through these conversations until about 10:30. So I'll turn it back over to you all. All right, so just take another minute, just one more minute to finish up your conversation. So we'll come back together. We'll come back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you. So the questions that you were talking and thinking through were mainly to get your creative juices flowing and start to deepen your understanding around some of these ideas, not to necessarily have you walk away and say, going back to Kasab, I now have total deep knowledge of a professional learning community, a community of practice, network improvement community, and I can now go out and do all those things. That's not what this is about. It was really to start getting you to think about, so what structure would make the most sense, and what are the elements of those structure for the work that you want to do as a collective going forward. Some folks I heard in the discussions in particular were having that conversation around, so what is the difference between a PLC and a community of practice? That was like a big part of the discussion. And where's our mic? Is our mic ready to go? Who could speak to how they responded to that conversation and that particular question? Because that was one that I heard in every group. You can absolutely volunteer someone else. Well done. Well done. Yeah.
So I think just, again, coming new and the discussion, the difference for me on PLC versus a community of practice has been more of a logistical. PLCs are groupings within the building versus the community of practices that I participate in. Groups within the state that then can put me in contact with other we're working on a similar topic. So for example, transition community of practice, where we're virtual and online, meeting that, but we work with smaller LEAs with this competency-based education. And so just at this point, my thought is it's just logistical. But we did have a really good discussion to dive, and that's what I looked at the learning.
Oh, well played. Well played.
I really don't remember what I said.
I'm sure it was profound. Yes. Yeah.
So my thought, the question that appealed to our group initially was question to you about professional practice. My immediate thought in looking at that question was that PLC is driven. Practice maybe
Interesting. Interesting. All right. Appreciate that additional. And then we have a response here. And I'm going to ask someone from this group to respond and weigh into this as well.
So this wasn't my thought, but it was someone from one of the outlying areas that shared it during the session. They said that they see communities of practice as focused on a specific problem in which you go outside of your PLC, go outside of your school or outside of your district, help bring in resources to focus on that.
Interesting. And so what you'll start to see, and we'll bring the mic over here. Do you all have your representative who's ready to speak on your behalf from this? Have you? Okay, so they're putting their finger on their nose. I want to understand is that a Utah thing or?
Put your nose, finger to your nose and point to somebody else.
Oh,
And
got
the
it.
person that you're pointing at is it.
Got it.
So voting and exempting.
So is this a Utah-wide issue or is this particular to this group? Okay, just want to, I like to pick up new traditions wherever I go. So.
For us, PLC, you're answering specific questions. In the case of schools, you're answering what do they need to know, what happens when they don't know. The questions are pretty clear. In a community of practice, you are bringing issues or problems that you're having that others are having as well, or others have experienced, and then brainstorming, problem solving around those. So one has an eye really planning. It does, address the what happens if with students, but the community of practice is very much focused around problem solving, where the PLCs have elements of planning as well, and other elements that go with it.
So here's what I'll suggest, and thank you for that last example. I'll leave you with this on that question. One could look at them as all pieces and parts of the other. And one can see elements in all of these things that are important. All of these words, at some point when you start to use them, they lose their meaning in practice because of how people implement them. So there are, for example, strong POCs that have all the elements of what you just described as a community of practice, and might even go as far as having the elements of a network improvement community because of how structured they are. And then there are also PLCs and communities of practice that are just places where people come and gripe about those darn kids. So, and they've lost all meaning and purpose. So the reason for the conversation was to invite you to start to think about, and that's why that last question was here, what do we need to learn more about in order to advance our work? Which of these elements did you hear that were important to you for the kinds of conversation and the kind of network experience you want to have? And that's what you want to bring into sort of what you co-construct as a state and as a region and as a network, so that you have the kind of experience that will actually advance your work. And so it's a lot. We could get into the sort of the nuts and bolts of the differences, but I think what's more important is what do they all have in common that can advance our work and the work that you're planning to do. So I invite you for having that conversation in your small groups. We're shifting now to, and this is where some of the other differences will sort of become obvious, into this whole notion of a problem of practice. So what I'd love for you all to do now is, as an individual, just take a moment to jot down your own definition of a problem of practice. And just like I asked you to commit to your hands 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm asking you to do this as an individual first. And then after everyone at the table has sort of got their definition down, then you all co-construct what you think is a good definition of a problem of practice as a table. And we'll hear some of those examples in just a sec. But take 1 minute, just 1 minute on your own, and then as a table, let's see if in 5 minutes we can come up with a co-constructed definition, working definition of problem of practice. So at this point, you're finishing your individual, and now your groups can begin to just talk through what are some of the common elements that you're hearing. And I know 4 minutes is not a lot of time, especially for the larger groups, but you can co-construct in about 4 minutes for a common definition of problem of practice.
If we work together, we probably have a common between the two.
No, you gotta drop it. Let's pull those together.
Well, I wanted a better word than something. A leader, or it could be a bias. Yeah, I felt like I started.
Practice it's outside. So. Going back to
So what I'm hearing. So let's say it again.
You good? All right.
Meeting the vision. And yes.
Take another minute. One more minute. Okay. Is it?
Okay. All right. This is great.
So they missed all of that. So for our virtual friends, we'll ask for some examples for them, just like we'll ask for some examples for folks who are in the room. What definition did you come up with? What's your working definition as a group, and who would be willing to share? Our mic is ready to go. Okay, they didn't point. They didn't do this time, but they pointed. So there it is. Yes.
So we came up with challenges, misunderstanding, or culture that impede the progress of a leader or group towards their vision or goal.
Nice. Nice. By the way, we're hearing from every group here, so let's just know that you might as well just go ahead and put your hand up at some point. All right, thank you. That was powerful. We heard some elements in there that I'm sure we can sort of chew on for a bit. Yes.
Ours is similar to what Paul said. Ours is specific practices that are preventing us from achieving our common goal.
Nice. So these consistent things that are keeping us from moving forward.
So obstacles that impede successful practice in order to benefit positive outcomes.
Nice. And that direct connection to students? Group in the back right here or over here? Whichever is easiest. Yep.
Ours is something that impedes the systemic purpose of an institution.
Wow. Okay. You all get deep here, don't you? That's good. That's good.
Ours is barriers to continuous improvement that impact student learning.
Nice. The barriers and then the continuous improvement that we've mentioned several times being important. Did we miss a group in here? Yes.
A concern inherent to the positional practice that requires collaboration to generate resolution.
You do radio, don't you, somewhere? Got that radio or TV voice. Yes. But the words that you said were also very important. So thank you for that. Let's hear from our online folks.
So from our Murray County Hughes group, actually, it's a challenge or lack of knowledge that is affecting my ability to successfully navigate or solve a situation within my scope of work.
Nice. Direct connection to what I can control, which I think is an important element when we think about the problem of practice. Other remote examples?
I do have another one. I'm not sure that this, hang on. Yeah, this is it. Time constraints and then follow through to determine effectiveness of implementation.
So certainly that being a piece of the whole problem of practice process, because at the end of the day, when we go through whatever structure you all suggest, it's about implementation of new practices, right? At the end of the day, we want to see something change as a result. So we had about 10 different definitions, and they're all right because they're what's problem, or that's what's top of mind for you all. You know, one of the ones that comes out of the Wenger book is this one that's on the screen. And I think a lot of what you all said can be found in this definition. So this whole notion of this persistent issue that just keeps plaguing us. And if we could figure out a solution to this specific thing, we could address and move forward. And as a result, it will the potential to improve understanding, experience outcomes, and we can think of outcomes for teachers, for leaders, for students. So when I look at this definition, which isn't the right definition either, it's just a definition, it encompasses all of what you all said. When you all move forward with the network structure, one of the things that you'll grapple with is, so which one of these definitions best sort of serves as a guidepost for the way we want to approach our work? And you all will want to co-construct and think that collectively and perhaps arrive at a common definition of a problem of practice. I'll leave that to you. But the other thing that you'll grapple with is, so what's the right grain size for a problem? You know, if your small community of practice takes on world peace, it's going to be a struggle. You might come up with some great ideas, but it's going to be a struggle. And the other extreme, if we want to come up with a way to have the copy machine not get overused, that perhaps is a too small of a grain size. So what's the right grain size for the kinds of problems that are those persistent challenges that you face become something that you'll grapple with? And then just what structure will you put in place for how those conversations happen? And we'll talk through some of those right now. So one of them, I love these questions because they're just basic questions. I always refer to them as theory of change questions, but people think of these in different ways. And so when you think about that one issue that I'm grappling with, and I walk myself through these questions. So what's the current state? And what will it look like when I achieve my results? And what do I need to learn in order to achieve those results? And then continuing on, what behaviors, not just mine, but my colleagues, need to change for us to achieve our goal? You know, you work through these questions, and particularly when you get to 6, well, how will I monitor my progress and how will I measure our effectiveness? These kinds of questions start to provide a framework for how a community of practice might think about its problem of practice. Another example, The PDSA cycle, which is part of the network improvement community approach, is a very structured way to engage in a problem of practice process. So you look at the P for plan, and you look at define the change, make predictions. It's very specific, the improvement science approach and the cycle. And then the carry out the change, and collect the data all along the way as you engage in this process. And then study what you see, analyze the data, compare what you are seeing to the predictions that you made on the front end so that you can see what the difference is across predictions and actual. And then decide on what you do next. Do you continue with this idea? Do you abandon it? Do you move forward with it? Do you take it to the next level? And when you're engaging in a PSA or PDSA cycle, you're going back to your aim or your specific issue that you're trying to address. In our language today, our original problem of practice. And you're going through the cycle. And again, today is not about, we're going to walk out of here knowing this whole thing, but you're going through this cycle multiple times because you try something, you test it, you learn from it, and then you come back and you reiterate and come back with another approach that takes into account what you learn, and you're constantly building on the previous approach with the idea that at one point, your system or your group or whatever the unit of measure is will change in a positive way. So just again, another example of a very specific approach. It's time for you all to do some of the hard work because I've been talking a lot and your facilitators have been talking a lot. I want you all to think about a problem of practice that you're grappling with in your own setting. It could be connected to something that's around adult learning. It could be connected to something that's around issues of equity. It could be connected to something that's around parental engagement. It's some school improvement problem that you're grappling with as a principal. And the reason I want us to go through this protocol in a very structured way is I want to give you a taste of what a community of practice can do for you when you followed a structured protocol. Will your protocol look like this in your community? We don't know. But this is an example of a community tuning protocol, we call it, that I'll ask you to engage in. Now, it's on the back of your, it's also on the back of your agenda, because I didn't think anyone or everyone will be able to read that, particularly from the back. And let's look at the steps that I'll ask you to follow. In your group, we'll ask you to identify someone who will be the timekeeper, because time will become critically important on these steps. All these times have been significantly reduced from what I would normally give people to do this. So keep that in mind. And if your group is large, you're going to have to go even faster because there's a lot of you to get through in terms of the conversation. And that's why the timekeeper is important. And then also it's important to have a facilitator of your conversation. And I would suggest that those be two different people. So step one of this is each person briefly describes some issue that they're grappling with. Briefly. This is where they say, my problem is we don't have enough parent engagement. Not to go into the whole thing, but just to say that's my issue. And as each person sort of briefly describes that, the rest of the group is thinking, what one problem sort of, or what sort of way can we collapse these problems into something that could benefit all of us if we talk about that issue, because we all have experienced the thing that that person brought to the table. So that's what that 5 minutes of the second step is. The group chooses one problem on which to focus from that point on. Now, that may take 2 minutes. So then you might be ahead in time and can give yourself 10 minutes to do the next thing. Because now, when that person in step one initially said is parent engagement, that's all they said. Now in this third step, they have 7 minutes to go into a bit more detail about their issue. And it is here that they can clearly articulate their goal or their desired state. What is it that they want to see change? What have they tried? What are some strategies that they've considered to try to solve this problem? They're just kind of doing a brain dump on what they've been thinking about related to whatever this problem is. Here's the hard part. Please do not ask them questions during this part. Please do not ask them questions during this part. It will be hard because you want to just have a conversation, right? This is that person just speaking, just without any sort of interaction with you. And this is one of those points in the protocol where it's going to be hard to follow, but I encourage you strongly to try to not do that, as hard as it might be. Okay, so then we're into that 5 minutes where listeners now can ask clarifying questions. Let me explain the difference between a clarifying question and another type of question. So that whole parental engagement issue, this is not a clarifying question. Oh yeah, okay, so you know what we did in our school was we went out and we had this whole parent thing and we brought them all to, that's not a clarifying question. A clarifying question is, so are there some groups of parents who come in and not others? Can you say more about the events that you mentioned that did bring parents in? I just want to get some clarity on that. That's the clarifying question. So only ask clarifying questions, and your facilitator will be the one who will say, oh, remember, that's not clarifying. You're going down that other path. So don't do that. Okay. The second to last step is the hardest, and I, again, strongly encourage you to do it. It might be tricky in this room, and some of you may want to even start this process where you're not close to other groups, because the person who had the original problem is going to turn away from the group while the group discusses some reflections on that problem. And your person with the original problem is not looking at the group in any way, shape, or form, but they're turned around listening to the conversation. So they have to be within earshot so they can hear everyone talk. And they're taking notes on what those folks at the table within the group are discussing. Just some quick notes about, and because later in the next step, they're going to come back and the presenter is going to go back to the group and turn around and face them and say, here's what I heard. And here's some things I'm taking away from that conversation. So that part about turning around, really important. So make sure that you're positioned in a way with your conversation that you can have that person turn around and still hear the conversation. If you get to that step and you're concerned about room noise, then I would suggest taking your conversation out into the hallway, coming over here to maybe it's a little quieter part of the room, just so that that person can hear the conversation of his or her colleague. Those are the steps. What questions do you have before I turn you loose into this protocol? David, any questions coming online from folks regarding the protocol? No worries?
Nope.
We're good? Okay. So I turn you loose. It is now, according to, I'll speak generically to this, whatever kind of phone it is that I have in my hand. It is 10, what is it? Is it 10:57? So we'll come back at 11:25. Let me make sure that it jives with my time here. We'll come back at 11:20. Nope, actually, let's come back at 11:30. Can we come back at 11:30? All right, so I'll see you at 11:30.
So each person.
You've done a really good job of setting up the structure in PSS. Outlined what is tier 1, 2, tier 3.
Coordinating, really guiding and motivating.
All right, just want to let our teams know that it is 11:15, so pay attention to the amount of time that you have left. 15 more minutes. All right, it is 11:30. So we're going to come back together. And we'll do it in 4, 3, 2, and 1. Want to make sure I'm on remotely as well. Okay, so went through the process. Our mic is ready to pass around. What we're not going to do is say, here are all the solutions I came up with. Here's everything that I thought through and everything in that conversation. But what I want to do is unpack the process. And so first I want to talk or hear from those people who were not the person with the problem, but the people who were there to support. How was the process for you? What were some of the strong points? Now that you've gone through the protocol as it was intended, what might you tweak? Just want to hear from those folks who didn't have the issue and hear your reflections on the process. Okay, here and then here, or whichever order makes sense for you.
As a participant, I really loved it. I loved when the protocol really obviously is well thought through, because we were saying it makes you stay focused, but it also makes you focus on the problem and not, oh, but my school, this, it was really helpful. But I also found that as a participant, I was constantly thinking about, oh, but I can apply this to another situation, and it was super beneficial. And I just think there was a stability and safeness in this whole protocol that made everyone, I never felt like there was any judgments. We were saying, like, the problem, like, wait, you've got tons of great things going on. Like, that's fantastic. So I think it became more of a celebration with a few ideas for solutions, but as a participant, I loved it. And we were saying, we would really like to see more of this, because you're leaving thinking, wow, we got somewhere in 34 minutes.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Thank you.
Details matter, and for you to emphasize the importance of the problem presenter turning away. And I think that detail, in these protocols, that detail of having Christina turn away really did spin our circle better and more. We weren't concerned about Christina interacting with us. What does she think? So that conversation flowed because of that very important and small detail of having the presenter turn away.
And, you know, I'm glad you raised that point, because it's the hardest thing for people to do. And one of the reasons, and people in this room have different ways of turning away. I will say we had some creativity in the turning away part, where some folks were turned away, but were still sort of looking at the group but looking down. But the point of turning away is when you see someone's facial expressions, you react immediately, whether you do it consciously or not. So if the person who's speaking says something, or you're not turned away, and you're looking at the person who's saying something about your problem, and they say something that conflicts or causes you concern or whatever, you're not going to roll your eyes, but you might have a subtle, just like, look on your face that might cause that person who's sharing freely to all of a sudden pause and maybe not be as free. And if we had let that person speak freely at the end of their statement, they might have actually come full circle, and you might have gotten an idea that, oh, well, if I had not rolled my eyes in a subtle way, I would have gotten the full story. So the turning around part is really important. And let me just say, looking at the faces of the people who are turned around, it's kind of fun because I get to see those facial expressions, because as they sit there and they're like, I see it, but you all don't, which is part of the whole structure. Okay, someone else is an observer. Yes.
One word that keeps coming into my mind is process. We're creating something as a group better than what we create individually.
Nice. So some good synergy happening. David, I'm going to ask any of our remote folks if they have a comment from the folks who were not actually presenting the problem. Not yet? Okay, so let's hear from the people who had the problem. So for you people with problems, let's hear how this process was for you. And again, we'll ask a response remotely as well as in the room. Can any of you all share? Okay, right over here.
Probably said before, I wish I could do it. Really what it felt like, but it was a really positive thing about it was close enough. No, just to hear all the ideas bounced off of each other. One idea kind of led to another, So it wasn't really just a bunch of random thoughts. It was a really good conversation about an issue that I was having. And so, I mean, my first thing telling them was, I'm sorry, you guys need to be the one with your back turned, because it was a pretty cool experience. So the ideas were there.
So let me ask you just a follow-up. Do you have a specific thing that you can now try as a result of the conversation?
Yeah, 3 specific things.
Oh, nice. Okay, excellent. So walking out with something that you can use, which is always good. All right, someone else who had a problem. What was it like for you? Over here.
I appreciate the description or the explanation as to why we turn away, and I definitely felt that the removal and the benefit of it. So I did turn to the side, but I didn't look at anyone, and I was hearing all of it and just sitting there and really just annotating every single thought, and then kind of highlighting for myself ones that really resonated with me. But also just there was such a wealth of knowledge and just care for my problem, even though I'm sure they're all really grateful it's not their problem. But I didn't get a sense that I was like, ooh, that's rough. Like, no, it was like, just jump right in with you and help you come up with some real, tangible questions and things that I just wasn't able to consider because I live this every day. So that removal, but that high level of care and expertise that kind of came my way. I mean, I feel like a rock star. So thanks, guys.
That's wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful. And what you've described is this whole notion of we assumed collective responsibility for your issue, for your problem. And we didn't see it as, like you said, oh, good luck with that. It was more of okay, we got to roll up our sleeves and dive into your issue. And we're going to do that as a collective. And when we walk out of here, you're going to be in a better place. The other thing I hope for those of you who didn't have the problem is maybe the problem was something that you didn't have that exact problem, but there were elements of a problem that you have that are similar to that problem. So even though you didn't walk out of here with the specific solution to your issue, I'm hoping you heard a few things that might advance your thinking on something that you're grappling with. I want to go to the online folks. Do we have anyone online who had a response from a presenter? So as we're waiting, anyone else in the room as the person who had the problem? Who else had problems? Okay. Right. So there you go. It is a loaded question. So any other reflections as the person with the problem?
So it was really good to turn all the way around. I really did have, as they defined the problem at first and kind of pointed at it, there was a couple things.
Right.
But by not turning around and slowing down the conversation, we got some perspective-wise and solution-wise that it really helped.
Nice. And
I didn't muddy up that conversation.
with your facial expressions or, right. Well, so here's the other part of the protocol that's hard, and that's the clarifying questions protocol part, because it's hard. You got a solution or an idea right there that you could just kind of put out on the table in the form of a question that could help solve this problem right now. We don't have to go through the rest of the steps. Is one way that, a brain can think. So sticking to just clarifying questions is hard sometimes, but you all seem, from what I could tell, to do that. So I appreciate that. David, anything from our online folks? So the protocol, if I were to tweak this, I reduced the time significantly. I would give way more time for, like when you all were trying to decide on a collective problem of practice, or the problem that I would give way more time for that, because you want to maybe unpack that a little bit more. And I would give more time for the individual with the representative problem, way more time to talk. And it's hard because you are just talking. And what I would encourage you to do if you're one of the observers is to honor the wait time as they continue to think through some of the things that they want to share. So way more time for that. But you can think about how you would tweak this. And some people have said at the beginning of this, because I always say you can tweak a protocol, do with it what you will. And some people say at the beginning before they do it, well, I'm going to get rid of that turn away step because that just seems like a nuisance. But then when they do it, they're like, now I see why you do that. I'll probably keep that in, but then I'll have to think about where I do this because I want to make sure that the people can hear. And that's a big barrier to this protocol because sometimes you're in a room where it's really noisy and I turn around and I can't hear or distinguish between this conversation and the one that's happening over here. So you may want to structure it so that you have more time to do those pieces. So I think we can celebrate the fact that we have some folks who are walking out of here with steps that they can take. And when you think about a professional learning experience, that's really something to celebrate, right? This whole notion that I got something real that I can go back and do and actually see if it makes a difference in my setting. The one thing I would encourage you to do before you leave your small group is to make a pact with some of the people who are in your group to check in someday after today on what happened. Because you're going to leave, and it's going to be a moment before you see these folks again. Set up a conversation. We've done this where you send an email to yourself. Like you can set up your email to go be sent like 3 weeks later. Hey, checking in. Let's see what's going on. You can set up a call. There's all kinds of things you can do. So I invite you to consider that with your colleagues at your table. And I invite you to celebrate in general. One of the things that as a community of practice or as a leader in a school that we don't take enough time to do, and that's celebrate. And as you look through that 1 through 5, just in your head right now, and I'm going to stop talking, do you do these things? Do you strongly agree with these things that these are in place in your system? Or do you strongly disagree? Where do you fall? And just as an individual, just look at 1 through 5. And this list, remember, comes from the book that I showed you at the beginning, Becoming a Learning System. There's a whole chapter on celebrations and the importance of celebrations. And these questions are taken from the beginning of that chapter. And in this particular book are a bunch of tools that are online that can give you some actual processes and structures to celebrate that progress. So now it's time to go back into your facilitated discussions. And so this is that half hour where you at your table groups can unpack even more the conversation that we just had. And the questions that you see that are not in highlight are the ones that are on your list that were there before. I added this highlighted question as an additional question for you to consider. So when you look at the first three questions, you can think back to the problem of practice questions that I asked, the whole notion of the PDSA cycle, and what does that mean? You can think back to this whole notion of celebrating progress and why that's important. But there's this question that came out of some of your conversation, and I should have added this before. You're in a community of practice, and you realize you don't have all the answers within the community. How and when do you get outside expertise? How does that look, and what form does that expertise come? So I invite you to have that conversation added to your other conversation questions. And then, as always, what do you need to learn more about in order to advance your thinking in all of this space? So it is now 11:45, right? And this is a half-hour conversation. We're going to come back in a half hour. I'll leave it up to your group to decide within that half hour if members need a small break on either end of the 30 minutes that we have right now. I'll see you back at 15 minutes after the hour.
So I'll just open up with what ways have the problem approach move 18 from the current state to the desired state. So this is what this is asking. Benefits. Yeah. Oh, that I awesome.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. All right.
5 to 7. 7.
Oh, it's, yeah, you had 7 theory of change questions, I believe.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, the whole PowerPoint will be accessible. Will everyone get the so everyone will get the whole PowerPoint.
7 and 5.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Got it.
Okay. Thanks, David.
All right.
Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Your mic is still.
Oh, there we go. All right, so we're going to come back together. Just in closing, I want to say a few more things before I turn it back over to David. So it's my hope, and we're coming, bring you back to the main group. It's my hope that you, in your conversations that you just had, talked through some of these questions and thought through some of these issues. And when I turn it back over to David, I know he's going to go into some specifics about what may be coming forward in the state. But I just want to leave you with a couple final thoughts. These aren't on the slides that you have, David, so this will be something that people will just see on the screen, which now I'm thankful that they can see it on the screen. But just a couple final thoughts. One, the fact that you're in this room means that you are a self-learner and you are learning by example. One of my favorite superintendents that you can't see in this picture because its background is such you can't see it, is Dr. Wendy Robinson from the Fort Wayne Community Schools in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the reason she inspires me so much is because whenever I'm in that district working with her cabinet around professional learning and around school improvement, she's at every meeting. As superintendent, she's got so many other things she could be doing, but she's at every meeting, sitting there from beginning to end, and she's a learner. And so she's modeling what it means to be a learner. And so as principals, I hope that's something you'll constantly think about is, how do I demonstrate that I'm not the person who just preaches, but I practice what I preach when it comes to being a learner? And we talked about this whole notion of don't underestimate how long it takes for people to change their practice. And Dustin and his bicycle was a great reminder. There are lots of other reminders for this. It takes time for you to change your practice and for your teachers and your students to be impacted by those changes. And then it takes time for them to change their practice as well. And I touched upon this briefly about the stages of concern. And so as you're thinking about your own change process in your own schools, be concerned about the concerns of others, because those things and those concerns can derail a lot of what you're intending and hoping to do. And number 4, and I know that everyone in this room is committed to this work and they're engaged in their own cycle of continuous improvement. They're always trying to get better. But if you're not, and if you're not in this for the kids, there's so many higher paying jobs that are out there that I would invite you to consider because our kids need those of us who are engaged in our own cycle of continuous improvement. The last suggestion I'll leave you with, I'll have to show you, and that is be careful how you support the change in others. There you go. Again, as you engage in your own change process and as you support the changes of others, just be careful how you do that. So at this point, I want to just say thank you for the time that you've given me today. Thank you for the time that you've given your colleagues and each other. It's been wonderful, and I'll turn it over at this point to David. Absolutely. Thank you. And for that video, the name of the toilet paper company was Les Trefle, Trefle, for those of you who want to use your search engine to get that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fred. We really appreciate you being with us today, and grateful for all this great information and this experience, this learning experience we've had today. It's just been marvelous. So let me just talk with you just for a couple of seconds. I'm only going to talk for maybe 10 minutes, maybe less, probably less. Although I do tend to be a little long-winded, as anybody who knows me can tell. but I really am. I thank you for taking the time out of your really, really busy schedules to be with us today, both you who are here and those who are out there online who have been participating with us. Please note that we do have a course evaluation that we'd like you to fill out. This is just very, very quick. It'll only take you 4 or 5 minutes to do it. We would really love to have that because we're always trying to improve what we do. We know there have been a few technical glitches today, but we've learned from those. We know what to do in the future. But please let us know what we can do better. Now, what this is all leading up to is we are ready to begin registering principals for principal partnership networks. We've been working on this for about a year, maybe a little over a year. Well, actually, it's been more than a year now that I think about it. Principal partnership networks are a response to what principals told us about their own professional learning. When we asked principals about a year ago what they wanted to do for their professional learning, their top answer was, we want to learn from each other. We want to have the kind of opportunities that you had today in the same kind of setting, in communities of practice, where the focus is on solving problems of practice that are common to principals in those groups. So we have set up a structure for principal partnership networks that we are very confident is going to be able to give you the kind of experiences that will help principals to grow. In the packet, for those of you who are online, you got even those of you who are here, in your email, as you registered, you received a participant guide. And in that participant guide, there's a map that shows you it's a map of Utah that shows the different regions that we are using for principal networks. So we're doing 10 principal networks across the state. Each one of those networks will have about 20 participants. We know that that's not a lot in some of the really large areas, but this is just kind of what I call a soft launch. It's saying, let's get this underway. Let's see how it works. Let's make tweaks and changes where they need to be made. But we feel like we've got something that can really work. So principals will be able to register for the network that is in their geographic area. So those of you who are out there listening online, for those of you in the regional service centers, the CUES Regional Service Center and SEDC, SESC, and NEWS, there are regional principal partnership networks that are set up for you. For those of you who are in the Wasatch Front or in northern Utah, we've created some regions for you as well, where we're going to be holding those principal networks. Lisa and I have been out talking with the boards, with superintendents across the state, or people in district leadership roles about our networks. And we've had some wonderful conversations about principal professional learning, and we have their blessing. They are in favor of what we're doing, and they've told us this is voluntary. If principals want to sign up, if they want to participate, we will support them fully in that effort. So we have that in place. We also are going to be meeting with charter school directors so that they know about it as well. And we've been emailing about this for quite some time as well. So there have been lots of emails that have gone out about these networks. So for each network, we have hired 2 facilitators who have been to a facilitator training, which was conducted beautifully by Dr. Janice Bradley, who is sitting right over there. Raise your hand, Janice. And Danny Sloan and Jared Fossen, who are from UEN. They came and trained our facilitators on facilitation skills and on online facilitation as well. So those facilitators are all ready to go. They are ready to start those networks. So registration is now open. It's on Midas. For those principals who want to register, we'll be sending out emails to every principal in the state, as well as the superintendents and the directors of the regional service centers, so that they know what's going on, they know what we're doing, and we will also be sharing with them lists of principals who are participating. The networks are for principals and charter school directors only. They're not for central office people. We want to make sure that the conversations can flow, and so that's the reason why we're limiting those to people who are in the trenches in the schools. So the registration is now open. All they have to do is go to Midas, and we will give them the course number that's for their region, and they just go in, type in that course number, and they can register for that. We have a limit of 20 principals for each one of these networks. 20 is an upper number. We're not going to put more than 20 in the networks. We're actually thinking that 12 or 13 or 14 is probably a better number, but we're willing to go up to 20 in these networks. So let them know. And then the first meetings will be held by the facilitators when the facilitators are ready to begin. I know I was just talking with two of our facilitators, Kip and Cray, right over here. Raise your hands, Kip and Cray. They're in the news region, and they've already got a date set up for their first meeting, and are going to be communicating with their people. So those of you who are facilitators for Principal Partnership Networks, would you please just raise your hand so people know who you are? So these are some of our facilitators. Thank you very much. Other facilitators are out in their regions, and they've been conducting the conversations with the people in their regions today. They've been online, and they've been helping with facilitating these discussions. So we want you to know that that's ready to go, and that we are certainly hoping that people will sign up. Excuse me. Oh, now it's not recognizing my fingerprint. Okay, well, I guess I have to put in my password. Okay, there we go. Okay. We're once again, we want to thank you for being here. Oh, by the way, we will also be doing some other things with principals as well. We'll let you know about those things as time goes on. I'm not going to commit to anything, but we'll be doing some other things as well as time goes on. That's all we have for today. Thank you again so much for being here. Thank you to Mr. Fred Brown for coming and participating with us, for coming up from Dallas and participating with us today. We so much appreciate everything. Fred, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And thanks to everybody.